welcome to the 2020 Glen Storytelling Festival. As you know, this year things have to be a wee bit different, but we're going to provide you with a virtual festival using storytellers, musicians from all along the Glens area. And I'm Liz Weir, I'm the festival director, and I'd like to introduce you to our storytellers, whom you're going to hear. We have Ciaran Mulholland, who's a musician, singer. We have Janice Witherspoon, who's based in Glenarm. We have Colin Urwin, another Glenarm man, who both tell stories and sing. And with Stephen O'Hara from Cushendun, storyteller who has been known to sing. Also part of our team will be Karen Edwards, who's going to come and join us over the weekend. So we hope you'll enjoy the festival. It comes to you thanks to the generous support of Mid and East Antrim Borough Council. We also have support from the Causeway Coast and Glens Heritage Trust, the Honourable the Irish Society, and also the National Lottery Communities Fund. So we hope you're going to enjoy the stories over the weekend. So sit back, relax, and listen to our tales. During the weekend, we're going to show you stories set in the landscape. We have a very beautiful countryside, a beautiful coastal area. The whole Causeway Coast and Glens coastal route is beautiful. So we're trying to set the stories in our own landscape. And again, you might see places you've never been to before, but we hope that when things open up in 2021, you'll come and enjoy the stories and come to the places where we've been telling them.
Ringfad is a rocky reef that shelters a wee sandy bay just north of the village of Carnlough. And generations of Carnlough people and Glenarm people have learned to swim there. And it's also great for gathering dulse and whelks. And the people that go down there nowadays probably never think of the terrible tragedy that happened there almost 200 years ago. A ship, a rich merchantman by the name of the Enterprise of Lynn, set sail from Rio de Janeiro in the new year of 1827. She was laden with precious cargo, and she had a crew of 22, including the captain's wife. The captain's wife was beloved of the crew. She had sailed with them many times. And she was no idle passenger, for she could read a chart, she could plot a course, she could navigate by the stars, and she could use a sextant. In fact, she had steered the Enterprise of Lynn from Valparaiso around Cape Horn to Rio. The crew thought her a lucky charm. And when they set off on their voyage of 6,500 sea miles from Rio, not a single man had any doubt whatsoever that they would reach their home port of Liverpool. And they set off. Away, haul away, we'll haul for better weather to me. Way, haul away, we'll haul away, Joe. And that's the way they crossed the Western Ocean and the equator. And 2 months later, land was sighted. And the wee man in the crow's nest shouted, "Land ho! 2 points in the starboard bow!" And everybody looked. And the land that they saw was the southwest coast of Ireland. And as glad as they were to see it, their voyage wasn't over yet, because they had to go up round the north of Ireland, Rathlin Island, down into the Sea of Moyle, with the Mull of Kintyre on their port side and the Glens of Antrim on their starboard side. But on the 10th of March, a storm blew up in the Irish Sea, and it was as ferocious as anything they had seen off Cape Horn. They hugged the coastline of the Glens of Antrim to take what shelter they could off the Antrim hills. There was a blizzard blowing, spindrift, and visibility was down to just a few yards. Snow coated the land right down to shore level. But the crew could see little lights in the cabins all along the shore, and that gave them great comfort. And they had every faith in the captain's wife, because she knew exactly where she was. She had taken a sighting at 12 midday, and she knew that they were only 4 miles from the safest anchorage on that part of the coast, Glenarm Bay. Sadly, what was not marked on her chart were the rocks of Ringfad. They struck the rocks, ran aground, holed the hull. She keeled over, and the waves done the rest, smashed her to smithereens, and 22 souls, including the captain's wife, went into the water. They were only 30 yards from the shore, but the weather was terrible. The people from all along the Largy shore come down to render what assistance they could, and perhaps to salvage a plank or two of mahogany or maybe a cask of brandy. Now, in those days, it was customary that mariners would wear earrings and finger rings. And not just for adornment, they had their names engraved on them and the names of their home ports. And the hope was that if anything happened to them in their voyage, well, maybe the value of the jewellery would be enough to get their bodies home so they could be buried with their loved ones. Every mariner shivers at the thought of being buried at sea. But when the people of the Largy shore came down, poor as they were, and saw these sailors bedecked with gold and silver and their richly dressed officers, they were seized by a kind of hunger, a frenzy. Knives were taken out, earlobes were hacked off, and fingers. Fights broke out as they argued with one another who had the best claim over who. And they became like a pack of wolves fighting over a carcass. As dawn broke over Ringfad, women pulled their shawls up over their heads, men pulled their caps down, and they slunk off home to hide their loot in below the thatch or in a hole in a ditch. But one family, local people by the name of McAlister, they took no part in the bloody business of that night. In fact, after the storm had eased, they collected as many bodies as they could. They wrapped them in shrouds and they carted them all up to Napan Cemetery, up on the side of the hill overlooking the Sea of Moyle. And there they buried them in a mass grave. And that happened 200 years ago. And since that time, the McAllisters have prospered in that area. All those other families did not. In fact, it is said that most of them came to bad ends. Not one family, and I shan't name any of them, own a single acre of ground along the Largy shore. Well, there is a local story that an out fisherman, out trawling for pollock up and down the coast one summer's evening, hooked into something. And he started to pull his line in hand over hand, thinking he had a big brute of a pollock on. And when he got it alongside the boat, he saw that it was a satchel or a leather bag encrusted with barnacles and seaweed. And as he reached over the gunwale to take hold of it, a hand came up and made a grab for it and pulled the bag asunder, and the gold coins drifted down in through the kelp and disappeared from sight. And of course the people said, he's caught a wee fish, and a big conger eel has come up and bit it, and the scales off that dead fish have floated down in, and that's what he thought were coins. And others say that the restless spirits of those sailors jealously protect the cargo of the wreck of the Enterprise. But every now and again, the sea gives up a gold coin or a silver spoon. And they say those restless spirits are harmless, but I wouldn't like to go down at Ringfad after dark. Thank you.
So I'm going to tell you a wee story from County Antrim. And it's from up near Doch. I'm sure some of you know where that is. Now, this is a story about a fella called John McAllister. And John McAllister lived up near Doch in a wee cottage with his mother. For John McAllister had never married, but the two of them got on without too much bother at all. And John McAllister, well, although he was a farming man, he liked to dress dapper, and he would take himself out on a Saturday afternoon and he'd put on a nice tweed suit and he'd go walking through the streets of Ballyclare. But there was one thing about John McAllister. He was awful bad with the rheumatic pains, and so he was almost like bent over. And so when he'd go walking through the streets of Ballyclare, the folks would go, there goes bent back John. Now, bent back John had a cow. And the cow was his pride and joy. It lived out in the wee byre, and that cow gave the creamiest, purest, bestest milk you could imagine, and lots of it too. And every morning he would take his wee creepy stool out to the byre and he would sit and he would milk the cow in the old way. Now one morning, he went out to the byre as normal, but he was awful bad with the rheumatic pains that day, and the only thing he could put in his feet were his bedroom slippers. And of course, wasn't it that day he was sitting on the wee creepy stool, milking away, when the cow got a wee bit shifty and put its hoof right on his foot, and he let out an almighty roar and he said, "Curse on you, cow," and he went hopping about the room. The pain was shooting through him, and it took him a good while to calm himself down until he got back down on the wee stool. And when he sat down again, he looked at the cow and he thought, she looked a wee bit scrawny, like the ribs were sticking out of her back, and he thought, "Och, it must just be a trick of the light," so he set to milking again. But the only thing that was coming out of that cow was all foul green stuff with a stench that would have turned your head. That cow gave him no more milk. And from day after that, the condition fell off that cow, and poor John didn't know what to do. But he had heard tell of a man who lived near Doak, who was said to have the cure and the charms. And he lived near the Whole Stone, which is said to be a place with great power in it. So he took himself off to see this old man, and when the old man asked him what had happened, he had to admit that he had cursed the cow. And the old man said, "Aye, well, it's sure that cow has been bewitched by the wee folk." But he agreed that he would come and have a look at the cow. So the next day, the old man turned up in the byre, and he had all his wee charm words with him, and he told John to hang on to the halter, and he put his hand on the back of the cow and he spoke some words. Well, the moment his hand was on the cow began to rise up into the air, and John McAllister with it. Up and up they went until, the next thing, John McAllister came to, and he was in some strange dark place, and he was surrounded by the fairy folk, a whole gang of them, all looking up at him. Well, he knew exactly where he was. Because in Ballyclare there's a road called the Lower Rathshe Road, and I'm sure you know that Rathshe is the fort of the fairies. And he knew all about this field in Rathshe, but he never imagined that he would end up right in it. But that's where he was. Well, he was still hanging on to this scrawny old cow, and a big argument took up then, with John McAllister trying to persuade these fairy folk to take this old scrawny thing back and give him his good cow. And the wee fairy folk were having none of it. Until one wee man stepped forward and he looked John McAllister up and down and he says, "That's a fine linen shirt you have on your back. If you give us that, then we'll maybe think about giving you back your cow." "My shirt you want?" "Aye. And then will you give me back my cow?" "Ah, well, no, that would not be entirely fair." He says, "That's a good leather belt you have on you. We could make a dozen wee belts out of that one. Would you give us your belt? And then would you give me back my cow?" said John. "Ah, no, said the wee fairy man. "That would not be a fair bargain." He says, "That's a fine pair of tweed trousers you have on you. We could make 20 wee pairs of trousers out of them." Well, this time it was John McAllister's turn to say, No, you want every stitch of my clothes for my cow." "Well," said the wee fairy man, "it's like this. You give us your clothes and we'll give you something else to take home as well." Well, he didn't see a way out of this. So off came the shirt and off came the belt and off came the trousers. And I can tell you, he looked like a right buck Egypt standing there in his underpants. And he looked at the wee fairy folk and he said, "Now, what's this other thing you were going to give me?" And they were all standing there.
and they all had wee skeels or sticks or nettles or wee whips, and they all rushed at him and they started beating and lashing him with all their wee sticks and whips, and he went out cold. Well, the next thing John McAllister knew, he was sitting on top of Fort Hillfield, on top of the fort, and he was all curled up, and his good cow was there licking the side of his face. Well, he kind of stood up very slow. Didn't he stand up? As tall and straight as a rush, as tall and straight as you or I. And he walked his good cow home. And ever after that, when John McAllister went walking through the streets of Ballyclare, the folks would go, "Ah, there goes straight back John." And he had his good cow back. But I'll tell you, just to make sure the fairy folk wouldn't bother him again, he put an iron horseshoe in front of his byre. For as I'm sure you all know, there's nothing the fairy folk hate more than iron. And that's the story of John McAllister.
So I'm going to play a wee tune for you now, and just in keeping some of the stories that we've heard there this evening, it's going to be one called The Fisher's Hornpipe. So feel free to tap your feet or clap along, but I don't think singing's allowed at the moment. So here we go, wee tune.
So how are you? I'm going to tell a story here about a spalpeen. And in case you're not sure what a spalpeen is, it was a class of agricultural labourer who journeyed through the country and went from farm to farm and from town to town, and they would work there for bed and board and small wages. And they get into the habit of going to the same place at the same point in the harvest each year. They were usually treated quite badly, not paid well, usually not fed very well or accommodated very well. But my spalpeen, he counts himself to be very fortunate, because he works for a farmer who's kindly and fair and generous, and he doesn't work him too hard, and he certainly doesn't beat him, which was the experience of many of the spalpeens. And anyhow, he's out working in the fields this day, and he's working on the potatoes, and the farmer comes into the field and he's carrying in his arms a potato of gigantic proportions. I mean, this thing is enormous, and his knees are buckling under the weight of it. And he calls to the spalpeen and he says, "Come here, fella, did you ever see a potato like that in your life?" And the spalpeen looked at it. He says, "God, that's a great spud." He says, "It's lovely, look at it. It has that many eyes on it." He says, "You wouldn't know where to look." And he says, "It's beautiful, beautiful. Smell the soil off it." "But I've seen bigger." And the farmer goes, "Oh, really? Where have you seen bigger?" He says, "Oh, one year my father grew a great crop of spuds." He says, the field was bursting and the potatoes just were coming into flower, and we went to bed that night and there was a sort of a sweet smell in the air, and when we got up in the morning, the entire crop was ruined, rotted in the ground, turned to mush. Put my father in an awful temper, and a wild lot of people lost the spuds. But what we did was we dug them up and we took them and wheeled them in barrows away to the lime kiln at the back of the house, and we just threw them all in there and thought, we'll chalk it up to experience, next year it'll be better. And we went on with our year's work. He says, but in the spring of the year, my father went out, and there must have been one good potato in that pile, and it fed off the fertilizer of all the other rotten potatoes, and this thing had grown to gigantic size, filled the lime kiln, was spilling over the walls. And he says, my father and a couple of men spent half a day in there with 2 big cross-cut saws, breaking this potato down into 4 bits. And he says, we got it winched out in ropes into trailers and away home to the shed for storage. He says, do you know, we ate off that all winter. And the farmer set his potato down and said, okay, and away he went. Now the next day, the spalpeen's out as usual, digging in the potatoes, and the farmer comes round and he's carrying over his shoulder, like a strainer for putting up a fence, a huge piece of cheese. And he calls to the spalpeen, here fella, come here. Did you ever see a piece of cheese like that in your born days? And the spalpeen comes up and he says, oh, that's a beautiful lump of cheese, look at it. He says, it's as creamy and white, and look at the big holes that run all the way through it. That's a fantastic piece of cheese. But I've seen bigger. And the farmer thinks, oh, here we go again. Okay, when have you seen bigger than that? He says, well, there was one year the grazing was that good in our farm. He says, the cattle grazed night and day. And he says, we made that much milk that we couldn't even carry it away from the place. We hadn't enough buckets or pails. We had nowhere to store it. And my father sent a couple of men out the back into the meadow, and they dug a hole in the ground. And the women folk carried the milk from the cattle and they poured it into this hole. And over the course of several days, it just filled up and up and up. Jippers, by the time they were done, you could have swum across it in 5 minutes. And he says, at that time, we had a young foal just born on the farm, he says, and he was a very curious wee animal. And he went up to the edge of the hole and he looked in, and the foal fell into the milk. Do you know, we never saw it again. He says, then women went in, up to their shoulders with great big churning paddles. And they stood in the middle of this lake of milk and they churned and churned and churned till it turned into cheese. With enough to do over 2 or 3 days, he says, we get the cheese cut into big lumps, about 100 weight each, and we got them all carted away and into storage. He says, do you know, in the spring of the year following that, my father went out to bring in a lump of cheese out of the shed, and he cut it open, and what do you think walked out of it? Only a full-grown horse. Now the farmer's beginning to catch on, the kind of a boy he's dealing with here. So he thinks, how am I going to get one up on this fella? For he can exaggerate nearly anything I would say. So he thinks about it. And the next day he comes in and he's not carrying anything. He's dragging behind him by the giant stalk, the biggest cabbage that anybody could ever have seen. This thing is like 3 foot round. And he's like leaning into it like he's in a tug of war, pulling this thing. And he calls the spalpeen and he says, here boy, did you ever see a cabbage like that in all your days? And the spalpeen looked at it and he said, God, that's beautiful cabbage. Look at it, it's as crisp and green and, oh, it's a wonderful cabbage. I've seen bigger. And the farmer says, go on. And he says, well, one year my father grew cabbages, he says, and they were that big that our cattle used to be fit to go and shelter in below the leaves of the cabbage as they grew in the fields. He says, in fact, our bull one year went in and he was sheltering in below a cabbage and an awful storm of rain came on. He says the leaf that was over his head just filled up with water until eventually it does what water does, and it collapsed. The water washed the bull down the field, through the hedge at the bottom of our farm, down the next field and into the river. We never saw the bull again. And the farmer, he winked and he says, now I know the kind of fellow you are. I tell you, I could do with a boy like you tomorrow. He says, why is that? And the farmer says, well, they're going to hang my brother for a crime he did not commit. And I could do with somebody like you to speak up for him at court. Would you do it? And the spalpeen says, God, I don't know. I have a whole lot of work on here with the spuds, you know. The farmer says, I'll make it worth your while. I'll give you a £5 note. The spalpeen said he would try. So the next morning into town they go, and in the centre of town there's a great scaffold built in front of the court's house. It's ringed round with black fabric, and there's a gallows on it, and a rope swinging in the wind. And they bring the farmer's brother out, and they bring him up onto the scaffold, and the hangman is putting a noose round his neck when the spalpeen speaks up to the judge, and he says, "Your Honour, this man is innocent of the crime for which you're about to hang him." And the judge looked at him and said, "Really? How do you explain such a thing?" He says, "Well, I can tell you, but I'll have to tell you a story in order to convince you." And the judge looked over the top of his glasses and he said, "Continue." And the spalpeen says, "However, before I begin, I must inform you that the story I tell you today, which proves this man's innocence, is going to be disputed by one person in this crowd. And, Your Honour, that is your guilty party." And the judge nodded his assent, and the spalpeen went on. And he said, "My father had a small holding of about 9 acres, but God be good to him, he passed away. And me and the 2 brothers inherited 3 acres each. And I looked at my bit of ground and I thought, I'm going to make a job of this. And I went and I bought myself a grand big white horse with a big flat back on it, like the top of a table, and 4 big hairy hoofs. This was an animal for pulling, not for jumping or leaping. And I took it and I looked at the back field behind the house and I thought, I'm going to sow this in oats. And I went to the shed, but you know, we were powerful low on oats at that time, and there was no oats to be had in the country. So I thought maybe England was the place to go. So I walked the old horse down to the water's edge and I climbed up on its back. And you know, the old horse walked into the water and started swimming. Well, I stayed in its back, and 3 days and 3 nights that horse swam across the water and just walked me up as nice as you like onto the beach. And hadn't we arrived in England in a market town on market day. So I just went up, he says, I bought myself 12 grand big bags of oats, and I brought them down to the water's edge, tied them onto the horse's back, climbed onto the top of the bags, and the horse just turned round into the water and started to swim me home again. 3 days and 3 nights it took us, and when we got to the shore at the bottom of our farm, the old horse was done. I think, in fairness, I had broke its back. I got the bags of oats off it, but the old thing looked done. Do you know what? I just took the halter off it, and I just turned it loose into the woods. It'll either die, says I, or it'll find rest. And away the horse went, and I went to sow the oats myself. And, you know, I managed to get the oats sowed on my own. It took a couple of days, but we got them in, and I waited all summer on the oats coming up. And when I saw it was time for harvest, I had nothing to do it with, only my own 2 arms. So I went and I brought a billhook out of the shed, and I set off into the field and up one drill with a billhook. But boys, it was very hard work. After maybe an hour, I hadn't even one drill reaped. And I got to the top, and just out of a bush at the top of the field rises the biggest hare you ever saw. And I thought, oh, we're getting hare for supper tonight. And I threw the billhook, for all I was fit at the hare. Whenever we had tumbled in the air, the blade didn't strike the animal, but the handle did, and it went into its rump. And the hare took off down the next drill and trailing the billhook behind it, and me running for all I was fit, and the sweat blinding me. We got to the bottom of the drill, and the hare just turned to avoid me and back up the next drill, all the way up and down the next and up the next. After about 20 minutes, I stopped, absolutely breathless, looked up, hadn't the hare only reaped the entire field of oats for me? Now, the crowd who was standing listening to this, country people aren't stupid. Nobody dared to say, I don't believe this, you're a liar. They were nodding away and agreeing as if, oh, that's the kind of thing we hear about here all the time. For country people are wise. And the judge scratched his chin and he looked at him and he says, carry on. And he says, well, now that I had the oats reaped, he says, I thought, how am I going to get them into the store for the winter? And I thought, I'll go into the woods and look if the old horse is living or dead. And I walked into the woods, and there it was standing, looking as fresh and as happy and healthy as the day it was born. And that's when I saw it, Your Honour. And the judge said, what did you see? He says, well, growing up out of its back was the biggest holly tree you ever saw in your life. And I climbed up onto the top of the horse, and I climbed up the holly tree, and I got to the top branch, and there it was. The judge said, what was there? he says, a fine, fat, pink salmon, fast asleep in its nest. Now, at this, there was a fisherman in the crowd, and he had heard all he could stand that day. And he stood up and he shouted, "You're a goddamned liar. There never was a salmon slept in a tree in a nest." And the Spalpeen turned to the judge, and he said, "Your Honour, I rest my case." And they took the fisherman from the crowd, and they hanged him, and they freed the farmer's brother, and the Spalpeen made a £5 note. And I don't know what happened to them people after that.
I'd like to tell you a story that was collected in the Glens of Antrim many, many years ago, and yet it's quite appropriate for the times we're living in. There was a farmer and his wife, and they had a bit of a hill farm, and you probably know the land isn't too great. They had sheep and more sheep. They had a cow they kept for milk, and they had a few hens and that sort of thing, but the farm wasn't great, you know, but everything had been going wrong. The cow wasn't giving the proper yield of milk. The hens were off the lay. Even the fences were broken down and the place needed painting. The man just wasn't at himself. These days we can use the term depressed, but in those days he just used to say he just wasn't at himself. And the farmer and his wife were sitting over a bite of dinner in the middle of the day one day when the door opened and in walked an old tramp. Now in those days, you'd get men and women of the road coming around. Nobody had to lock their doors at all. And they were always greeted warmly, and of course the farmer and his wife brought the old man in and set him down, and all there was potatoes and buttermilk. But anyway, they shared what they had. And over the course of the meal, the farmer was talking about all the things that were going wrong with the farm. And the old man listened. When he stood up to go, he said to them, "Listen, maybe I can help you." And they looked at this old boy. How would he help? But out from his ragged old jacket pocket, he brought a lump of gold. He said, "That may help you." The farmer and his wife looked at him and said, "Thanks very much." And with that, the old man turned and was gone. The farmer's wife said, "What are we going to do with this?" He says, "Bury it there. Bury it there by the hearth." And this was in the days when you'd had earthen floors, you know. So they buried it there, and then they started to talk. The wife said, "What about getting another cow?" "Ach, not at all. That cow's a great milker. She'll come back to herself. We'll get you some more hens." "No. So those hens are off the lay, but they'll be grand. They'll be grand." "I know," she says. "The whole place is falling down. We need fence posts. We need paint." He says, "I've got the fence posts. I've even got the paint. It's in the hay shed there." And they talked. And the lovely thing about a story is you can say time passed. A whole year went by. The tramp man turned up again, this time meat and 2 veg for the dinner, and they shared what they had. They were delighted to see him, and they were full of all their news, all the good things that were going on. I mean, there was a rooster crowing proudly, there was a new calf in the field, the place was all painted up, looked terrific. And the old man could see from the food they were prospering. So he said to them, "Tell us this, what did you spend the gold on?" They said, "Well, we have to thank you. This is all down to you." He says, "Aye, but what did you spend it on?" Well, a look passed between them and said, "To tell you the truth, we haven't spent it at all. It's still buried there by the hearth. All we needed was a wee bit of a lift, and that's what you gave us." And the old man smiled to himself and he said, "Listen, I'm going on from here now, but would you mind if I took it on with me? Because that bit of gold might give somebody else a wee bit of a lift." And with that, they gave him the gold and away he went. And isn't that how it is for all of us these days? It's not necessarily telling you how much of a grant you can get or what benefits you can claim. It's somebody saying, "Sure, come on out, we'll share a story or two. Come on out, I'll meet you for a cup of tea," or even just give somebody a phone. And that's why I love that story. It's called A Wee Lift. Thank you.
So I'll just sing you a wee song, and this one was collected just at the end of the lane where we currently live, just underneath Slemish Mountain itself. And this is a wee song that is a wee chorus, so for everybody at home you can join in where it's safe to do so. So here it goes. Happy are we all together, happy are we one and all. May we lead a life of pleasure, oh may we rise and never fall. Though how humble is our dwelling, troubles we have shared a few. Happy was our day of meeting, you to me and me to you. So happy are we all together, happy are we one and all. May we lead a life of pleasure, oh may we rise and never fall. Times are hard, we've got no fortune, but good health we have for sure. This to us is more important than any wealth or worldly store. So happy are we all together, happy are we one and all. May we lead a life of pleasure, oh may we rise and never fall. Oh, see the miser with his fortune, watching o'er it cautiously. But we'll have fun and social pleasure and spend each night in harmony. So happy are we all together, happy are we one and all. May we lead a life of pleasure, oh may we rise and never fall. Friendship makes the heart grow fonder, friendship lets us all unite. Friendship brings us all together, and friendship brought us here tonight. So happy are we all together, happy are we one and all. May we lead a life of pleasure, oh may we rise and never fall. So happy are we all together, happy are we one and all. May we lead a life of pleasure, oh may we rise and never fall.